But today we're going to talk about fake news and how we can help our students to find credible news sources. Um, so as I said, my name is Dr. Jennifer Tole. I teach in the Department of Writing Arts at Rowan University. I teach, and the students that I see vary. I see students in their kind of freshman level entry courses, but mostly I teach in the technical and professional writing. One of the courses that I teach there is called Writing for Nonprofits, and that's how I first started getting involved with groups who work with literacy and adult learning efforts in our area. Um, so we're going to focus on one specific aspect of information literacy. So again, that idea of how do we find, evaluate, and use information that we find around us, to think about specifically what we see in the news and kind of why this matters and how we can help our students to make good choices. So our agenda for today is to first think about what fake news is. There are a number of ways of interpreting that term, and there are a number of ways of thinking about kind of like news satire or misprints in the news, and that's not really what we're talking about here today. And we'll kind of share together our own definitions and experiences with fake news. But here we really mean news. I'm going to use like scare quotes here. Information that's presented as factual that's actually intended to deceive people, right? That's like knowingly incorrect and used to fit a certain agenda. This is challenging for native English speakers and digital natives. So a 2016 study done out of Stanford found that over 80% of middle school students overestimated their ability to decipher fake news and could not distinguish legitimate news from ad-sponsored news or kind of news that was deceitful. So if we find that most kind of native English speakers or most digital natives have trouble distinguishing what's real and what's not, what does this mean for non-native speakers? What does this mean for people who are not digital natives, right? Who are not familiar with getting information, from social media, etc. And as I mentioned at the top of this talk, and to Eric's really great point, this seems to matter more than ever, right? There's so much information out there, and it becomes even more difficult to decipher what is legitimate and factual and what is meant to deceive us. So we'll think about why this matters to our students in particular, and then we'll close by thinking about what we can do with our students to help them navigate fake news in their own lives. And I'll share with you some ideas that I have, and hopefully we'll have some time. There's my dog chiming in. Hopefully he won't be too much of a bother. And hopefully we'll get some ideas from you all as well, things that we can, practical things we can do with our students to, if nothing else, to at least, have this conversation and get it on the table that this kind of misinformation exists. Okay. So first I wanted to share with you a few examples of fake news so we can just get a kind of concrete sense of what I'm talking about here, what it looks like, and think through some kind of impacts this can have. So this is an article about climate change. It says that NASA admits that climate change occurs because of changes in Earth's solar orbit and not because of SUVs and fossil fuels. And you can click through, and you'll have access to these slides. You can click through all of them to get to the actual article as well, which is taking a moment to load. But what's fascinating about this article is that it received 4.2 million engagements, meaning 4.2 million people clicked on, shared, commented on this article. And when we take a first glance at it, we can see a lot of ways in which it looks like a legitimate news article, right? We have a headline, we have a date, we have an author, we have some tags here or topics that are related. We have a picture. And then even just without reading the content of the article, I see what looks to be facts, right? I'm seeing numbers. In the year 1958, I'm seeing that they're citing NASA. There's some other data here, something happened in the year 2000, this Milankovitch climate theory. They're talking about, scientific things like carbon dioxide. And if you look at the content of this article, basically what it's claiming, oh, and look at this, even more kind of facts, right? We have this figure that looks scientific to a non-scientific person like myself. We have some equations and data. There are many ways in which this article is seemingly legit, right? Or is made to seem as if it is based in science. And the point of the article is that no, climate change is not caused by people and is in fact just a natural byproduct of the way the earth rotates. And so therefore we don't need to make legislation, to stop climate change. We don't need to make personal choices about how we take care of the environment. Um, all of this, is just a natural part of the way the world works. So here's my question for you. Amid all of these seemingly legitimate things about the article, is there anything that might tip you off that it's not actually factual? And this is like a real question. If anybody wants to, as Eric said, raise their hand or put an answer in the chat.
Right. Not a rhetorical question.
Yes.
So either you can put something in the chat or raise your hand, and then we can unmute you. And the reason we want you to raise your hand is so we don't have folks kind of willy-nilly trying to chime in.
And I'll just kind of scroll down so you can see too a little bit more of the article.
Yeah, so Lorraine saying the photo, Saeed saying like it says NASA admits, but it doesn't give a source.
Good. What's one thing you might do, and this might be sort of, and like I said, I'm not a science person, but I see a diagram like this, I'm like, oh, this is clearly science, right? So here's the first thing you might do if you weren't sure. And again, we're thinking about 4.2 million people clicking on this, sharing this. The first thing I would probably do is check out what natural news is. And if you're not familiar, it just so happens to be kind of one of the biggest, most widely kind of out there propaganda, super conspiracy theory. I'm trying to click on, or I can actually go to the About Us. If you go to the bottom there, you'd find the About Us, and then you'd start to read a little bit more about this organization. And as I said, they're a really well-known kind of conspiracy theory organization, I guess you could say. And it's taking a long time to load up. But you see that they claim to be a science-based natural health advocacy organization. They're empowering consumers about certain issues. What you'll find if you look through their information is that they're just have these kind of wild conspiracy theories about vaccines and about the government and about corporate corruption. And I'll show you some resources where you can do some fact checking about what they say. But when you do this fact checking, you'll see that many of this is sort of just not based in science. And the, I think I actually have for you on the next slide. Did I include it? Yeah. So Snopes is one of, if you're not familiar, Snopes is a really popular and very helpful fact checking guide. And they this is from Brandwatch, which is another kind of fact checking organization. And they take a look at this particular article and they kind of debunk on sort of all of the reasons why this is not true. And that kind of goes through and tells you about, why this information is out there and how potentially dangerous it is. So this example, right, where something kind of seems like it's based in science, it's the important thing here, and we have so many people, clicking on it and believing it's true, is that people make decisions based on what they read in the news, right? If I believe this article, and by the way, that theory about the NASA theory that they're quoting there about the Earth's orbit, that is a thing. That is a real scientific fact. But NASA never claimed, nor did the scientists involved, that this was sort of the culprit, right? Like why global warming was happening. That is not verified by the science. But this news article, purports or sort of frames it in that way. The problem is people make choices, right? About all kinds of things in our relationship to the environment that could be potentially really damaging. If we kind of deny the real science that there is this problem that needs to be addressed, then it becomes, then it goes unchecked.
So Gordon had his hands up. Gordon, do you want to chime in?
Yes, thank you. Just from the headline, it was admits. So it's like, it sounds like a government agency that was trying to deceive you, and they admit, and then, saying admit implies that it's true, and that, they finally admitted it. This thing that SUVs don't, and human activity doesn't cause it. And the picture, there's a lot of red and orange, kind of like, I've never seen a picture of Earth anything like that from space, but it's like, oh, it's burning because of the sun.
Yes.
Yeah, Jen, can you go back up actually to that page?
Yeah.
All right, because, or keep going back, yeah, and there were some questions about the link, but we'll send out the slides, which will have the click-through link to it. I mean, one thing to me when I see here is on their banner, I actually scroll up so we can see their banner, the Natural News banner. So in the Natural News banner, the version of the American flag that they have is like the original 13 colonies flag, right? And so then that's somebody who's letting you know their political beliefs, right? That the colonies flag is associated with, like archly conservative perspectives on these things. No, Ryan, this is not a joke site. So we'll share a link to this when we have that, when we share the slides.
Yeah, those are really awesome observations, Gordon and Eric. I didn't even notice the flag, Eric, but that's a really great point. And whenever you see, and it's not to make a comment about a particular political affiliation, but when you see that something that's presented as science, right, is being delivered by an entity with a clear political leaning, then we should be aware of that, right? If not suspect. Those are really great points. And for the discerning eye, right? And when we do a little bit of investigation, we might see these kinds of things. But for the casual reader, or as I was saying earlier, for a non-native speaker, for an adult learner, for someone who's not familiar with reading news on websites, this might slip by. So these are all really great points. And as Eric mentioned, on the slides that he'll share with you after this presentation, everything you can click through it and find too. So if you wanted to use any of this information or investigate it further, you're welcome to do that. But all really great points. Keep them coming. All right, let's look at, and Gordon, you mentioned the picture, and pictures do, and one last thing, sorry about this one, Snopes, which is another kind of fact-checking website organization that you can use. I've created a click through here where you can read through, and Snopes goes through and just piece by piece kind of debunks what's in this article and tells why it's false and sort of explains it further. So if you're interested at all, feel free to click through here and you can see that. As Gordon noted, pictures tell a story, right? Pictures are strategically chosen and packaged in a way to tell a particular story. So here's an infographic. I'd like you to tell me, someone, what's the story being told in this infographic? And it's a combination, as all infographics, it's a combination of text and graphics, right? With some strategic moves here. What's the story being told?
Right, and you can either use the chat area, or if you want to get unmuted, you can raise your hand and we can do it that way. So Lorraine's saying the crime rate is related to race.
Yes, Lorraine, and even more specifically, how so? Who's doing the crime to whom?
Black crime.
Yes, right?
Right.
And there's a number of visual cues here. Beside the wildly negative image of a black man here wielding a gun in army fatigues with, he looks like a gang member, right? He looks violent, looks dangerous. He's pointing a gun. Besides, just even bracketing that, as I said, wildly suggestive photo, look at how this information is arranged. It's telling us that in big blue letters, right, that are not only larger but standing out in blue, that only 1% of Black people are killed by police. And then if we scroll down here, that Blacks killed by Blacks make up 97%, I guess, presumably, of crime, right, of Black people who are murdered. I think the story here in big red letters is that 97% of those cases are perpetrated by other Black people, right? So there's a story being told here, and the story is that it's Black people killing Black people. It's not police, it's not white people. And the statistic just above it that stands out, that 81% of, I guess, of 81% of cases where white people are murdered, the perpetrators are Black, right? That's the story being told here. And they're highlighting for you in colors and in the size of text what they want you to focus on. As I said, they're using an image that's clearly meant to invoke fear. What makes this look legitimate, however? Or not however, like what would make you think that this was real?
Yeah, so they cite a source.
Cite a source, right? And we tell our students, you know, we assume that if a source is cited and it sounds fine, Crime Statistics Bureau, right? And it looks like an infographic that you might see. Here's the problem with this infographic, and problem doesn't even begin to describe it. Oh, and just so that you know, and this is not a political commentary, this is just to show you how fake news can be very insidious and spread to even the highest levels of communication. This was a infographic that was shared by the former president in a tweet in November of 2015. He actually shared this infographic and said, and quoted, as I pointed out, that one of the more shocking statistics or the standout statistics there, that Black people kill 81% of white homicide victims. So again, this is not a comment on a particular political party, but just to show you how information that is false, just not true, can be spread even by people who are in leadership positions or even in people who have access to all kinds of communication. Here's the problem. As I already noted, that image is meant to provoke fear. It feeds into this racist narrative of young Black men. It's strategically chosen, right? But more than that, the actual quote data and facts in this are not real. If you actually take the proportion into account, Black Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police. Actual statistics that are available from the FBI demonstrate that the statistics used in this infographic have in fact been reversed. That is actually approximately 81% of whites are killed by whites and approximately 16% of whites are killed by Blacks. And this has been kind of statistically true. Sorry, my dog is barking. If he doesn't stop in a moment, I might excuse myself and let him out. The statistics show, and have for a long time, that more white people kill white people and more Black people kill Black people. So those are the kind of real data. And finally, there's no such entity as the Crime Statistics Bureau. It is a completely made up thing that does not exist. And it's intentionally meant to sound real in order to deceive you. And as I just showed, you know, this is terribly problematic because not only is it untrue, but as I pointed out, it can spread virally. And as we talked about at the very beginning of our conversation together today, you know, the world that we live in right now, there's so many issues related to race and related to, you know, there's a lot of like healing that needs to happen. There's a lot of progress that needs to happen. And when fake information like this that is intentionally meant to stir the pot, right, meant to feed into these long-held narratives that divide us, this is a problem. And it has really practical implications for ourselves and for our students, for the decisions we make, for the people that we elect, for the way we treat each other, all of those kinds of things. Just a couple more examples, and we'll talk more about sort of how we can help our students navigate all of this.
Jen, before you move on, can I make so can you go back up to the previous thing? So there's two things that I wonder about this. So I wonder like the point, I understand the point of coming up with like a, you know, like a fake source, right? So, but I wonder what the benefit is to having like a completely fake thing as opposed to claiming it was the FBI, right? And just like lying straight up and saying it was the FBI. And I wonder if it means that like if you go to the FBI site, it's immediately debunked, right? As opposed to saying like, oh, Crime Statistics Bureau Like you can be like, oh, I went to try to find that and I couldn't see it, right? And the person that sent it to you is like, well, maybe you just didn't look hard enough, right? And so then you've got the plausible deniability. The reason that you can't find that information is that not that it's not true, but you can't actually find it. And then I think the other thing that's really important with this piece of information, as you're saying about the narrative, right? This fits into the narrative of black on black crime, right? And so these commonly used phrases that people repeat become common sense that they're not questioned, right? And so then this feeds into black on black crime, but nobody says white on white crime, right? That's not a phrase that people use, even though the FBI statistics show that white on, quote unquote, white on white crime happens at the same proportion as quote unquote black on black crime, right? But the everyday language that we use fosters these narratives that people don't then question.
Yeah, absolutely. My dog is agreeing with you.
Your dog agrees, yeah.
No, but it's so true, Eric, and that's what to me is so insidious about this is that it's not just it's not just one story, one infographic, right? And not just they're not mistakes, right? As you said, this isn't a misinterpretation of the FBI's data that anyone could find. This is a knowing and purposeful, just lies, right? And they're trying to cover their tracks. I think you're right, Eric, by giving this fake source that you could never find in order to debunk it because it does not exist. But the insidiousness of this, as Eric is pointing out, is that it becomes this unquestioned way of viewing the world, right? That is not based in fact. And one of the things that I'll share in a couple minutes about sort of why this is so important, because it's not just isolated articles. It's a way of thinking about, how we relate to each other, as I said, and kind of how we, the decisions that we make. It becomes part of, as Eric said, this kind of unquestioned narrative. And so we need to kind of find ways of, I think the first step is just acknowledge, being able to recognize and to help our students and people around us recognize that this is out there, and that it's having impacts on our world, our life, how we interact with each other in ways that we probably don't understand. So another kind of, thing that's been going on, obviously, over the last 14 months or so is this public health crisis, right? A global pandemic. So I wanted to talk about this briefly because, we are finding obviously this is an unprecedented crisis for us, right? We rely on our public health institutions more than ever to help us make good decisions, right? What's safe, what's not safe? How do we protect ourselves and people around us? But this, and again, we have so much access to information, and much of it, similar to what we've been talking about, is not factual and is meant to fit a particular agenda. So here's an article that I found, and here's the headline. You can see it says that coronavirus is a bioweapon, how China stole coronavirus from Canada and weaponized it. And it comes from this Great Game Media. This, to me, as an academic, looks like a scholarly journal. If you click through to the actual article, let me get rid of this one. Here it is. And again, I said, this kind of headline to me looks like a legitimate academic or scholarly article. I see as I scroll down, this one is so fascinating to me. Sorry if my scrolling is making you dizzy. I have these pop-up ads, which should tell you something, right, from the start. But anyway, I'll ignore that for a moment. And I'm looking down to see that the main point of this idea is that COVID came from Chinese agents who were working in a Canadian lab, and it's part of this biological warfare program, wherein it was, strategically deployed globally as this bio weapon, right? I can see that there's a doctor being quoted here that I can click on, who I can click on. I see this table of contents that looks like a Wikipedia site, which is familiar to me. And because it's aligned with, because it's done in the style of a Wikipedia table of contents, it feels comfortable to me. It feels legitimate, right? It feels like it feels like an encyclopedia, an actual source. I click down, I can ignore all these ads, and I have this really, eye-catching graphic where it's clear that coronavirus is a bioweapon that's being weaponized by China. And then there's data, right? We have dates, we have doctors' names, we have links out to things that make it look, like this is legitimate. Oh my God, we have X-rays. This is like proof, right, of something. Again, lots of ads in the way. We have, diagrams of the virus that are apparently come from these legitimate places. I can keep going. So this one, right, which is, looks in so many ways to be legitimate. What might tip you off, though, that this is not real?
All right, so either you can ask to be unmuted or in the chat section.
And I'll do a little scrolling just so you can see.
So Sylvia's saying the ads for sure.
Yes.
And Nancy's saying just like the name, Great Game India.
Yeah, and I didn't know much about this organization, so I just did, a simple little bit of Googling and found that it's basically started by one person. It's another kind of like far, I don't even know if I want to say far right, just kind of like conspiracy theory driven organization that's meant to look like this international journal. And it's not, right? It's basically just people kind of voicing their opinions in a particular agenda. But you can see, like, look, they have publications, they have lectures, they have a press release. If you click on this doctor, that they quote, this bioweapons expert, Dr. Francis Boyle, is actually a bioweapons expert and is a doctor. But if you do a little bit of digging into him, you'll find that he is, again, a kind of like conspiracy theorist. A lot of his theories are not based in fact, or not accepted by the scientific community. And there's a couple other things. The ads absolutely are a huge tip-off, right? If this is a legitimate scientific source, if this is a kind of journal, like it's, I don't know how many of you do reading in scholarly journals. I know it's not like, the most fun thing to do, but you're not going to see ads for children's. I have 2 little kids. I guess that's why they're trying to sell me children's clothes. You're not going to see, donate to, real academic journals. They're not trying to get you to buy things. The other thing, and this kind of struck me, did anyone notice the date of this article?
Yeah, it's January 26th.
So that can't be, right? We can't have an article that's written. I mean, maybe this journal is so advanced that they can see into the future and already before the pandemic kind of broke. So the date's just wrong.
Yeah.
It's either, I guess it could be a typo, but there's something really weird about that because the information that's in the article happened much after this date. There's a lot of things here that, again, if you are a more savvy reader, that you might pick up on. But the problem is that many people are not, right? Many people are duped by things that are meant to look, legitimate in this way. I see a hand, Lauren. Did you want to?
So Lauren? Yeah, Lauren, did you want to chime in?
Okay, well, if it comes back to you, or if you want to, say anything anytime, just stop us and we can talk more. I wanted to add one more kind of piece to this issue of kind of public health and things like that, and why this matters. Oh, let me get back to the slides. This is another one that comes from our old friends at Natural News that we talked about a couple of moments ago. And this is an article about how vaccines containing mercury are, quote, medical genocide that target Black communities to damage their babies. And if you click through to this article, as I said, good old Natural News, and this one's a little bit older. We have a baby here, a cute baby, and this one might be a little more clear as you start to read, but it's citing some famous people. Robert Kennedy Jr. is a kind of vaccine, he's outspoken about vaccines and dangers that he sees in them. We're quoting kind of famous people here. We have this, they're linking out to other articles, which just happen to be other articles that Natural News has put out, which is kind of like a weird way to cite yourself. Again, they keep citing themselves as sources. This information from the CDC is not real. This links out to cdc.news is not the Center for Disease Control. This is again, purposely appropriated use of the CDC. This is not the actual CDC's website. But again, how would you know that, right? I mean, all we hear about these days is the CDC. How would you know that this is not? They're actually, and you can kind of see this here. CDC pushing COVID scariants propaganda to keep America enslaved in fear in capital letters. That should be a tip off. But anyway, you might not realize that this is not the actual CDC website. So they're linking out not only to themselves, but to just patently false sources. And you can kind of read through, but the real issue here is that the message being told to the reader here is that vaccines are not safe. And this is really problematic, particularly, and this is written before COVID, so we're not even talking about COVID vaccines here. So that's a kind of a different issue altogether. But this is just about vaccines in general, your polio vaccine and your flu shot and all that kind of stuff that we just know keeps people safe, right? So this is a real problem because here we're targeting vulnerable communities and encouraging them to make decisions that could quite literally be life or death decisions, right? About health, about the decisions that we make. So I wanted to use these particular examples of ways of showing like what fake news can look like, how insidious it can be, the different maneuvers and strategies that people use to make things look legitimate, but also to think about the really high stakes here. We're talking about decisions that people make that affect who they vote for, that affect health decisions that they make, that affect the way that we treat each other and the way that people get along as a community and as a country. We're all making decisions, and sometimes those decisions are given to us, or the suggestions are made by people who are purposely trying to deceive us. So
Jen, can I chime in here for one thing? I think the issue around particularly this headline here, right, about African American community and vaccines, right? So like the black on black crime, this sort of news doesn't happen like in no context, right? So, historically in the United States, African American community was experimented on, right, by medical science, right? So there's a long history of African Americans being guinea pigs for medical science, and so there's an understandable skepticism, right, in the African American community about how science works, right? And so but that's different than kind of taking the next step and suggesting that like you can shed vaccines and things like that, right? And so, but I think that sort of stuff builds on, in some cases it builds on historical examples, but rather than thinking about the historical examples and what impact it might have now, it's just repeated into this sort of like blanket statement.
those are great points again, Eric. Thank you so much for your insight, because you're right. It's not, there's a way in which to it, and I'm sure many of us have seen this, and this is a good segue into the next part of what we'll talk about, which is sort of like, where have we seen this in our own lives, and what does it mean to us? You can probably see, if you're like me, on your own social media feed, right? People can cherry pick because of the sort of wealth of information out there. People can choose what they want to believe, right? And then they can find something to back it up. So to Eric's point, things like this, rhetoric like this, feeds into a long-standing and legitimate, like, historical context, right? Where there was this history, and instead of sort of acknowledging that and moving forward, rhetoric like this reinforces, right? this kind of narrative that is actually going to harm people in the long run, right? Because it's going to influence people to make choices that are against their best interests and against the best interests of the people around them. And so I really like Eric's point that, it's not, none of these things happen in a vacuum, and they're all part of narratives and bias and just kind of ways, viewpoints that people already hold. So then when we see things like this, it confirms what people already think, right? Or it confirms biases, or it confirms agendas that people already have, and just kind of bolster these things and make them even stronger. So with that, my question, have you or someone ever been duped by fake news? Have you ever been fooled by any of this, or maybe your students or someone that you know?
Saeed, I saw you had your hand up. Is that an answer to this question or a previous comment? Oh, you're still muted, Saeed.
There is a comment in the chat from Time FN. I think we should address that comment. It says, my child was vaccine injured and I was injured too. Please stop saying that vaccines are good for everyone. I think we need to address that question and that observation. There's someone in the chat who wrote that. I think we should address that.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Saeed. I can't see the chat, so I couldn't see that. And I appreciate whoever wrote that in the chat. And I don't think we really have the time or space, or it's really beneficial for us to talk about the efficacy of vaccines. I guess my point in bringing up that example is that article is not true. It's the information in that article is, and I've kind of pointed out some of the ways, is intentionally made to deceive people, right, into believing things that they are purporting are as facts. So while I think that, and I agree that I'm not here to preach about vaccines, but I'm just trying to show that on an issue that's really important, right, like a health issue, that people should make their own decisions about, and they should be well informed about. The problem is that the information that we get is sometimes made to deceive us. And so things that we think might be actual, based in data or based in facts are not being facts. I have to just make a comment, Saeed. I am so jealous of the bookcases behind you. They are beautiful. I don't know if that's a backdrop or not, but I wish I had something like that in my home. So thank you for bringing that up, and thank you for whoever left it in the chat. I appreciate it. To this question though, has this issue of fake news come up for you at any point? Have you ever been fooled by something that you read, or seen someone be fooled, or had a student be duped by this?
Well, I can certainly share. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I've somehow transcended the the fake news semiosphere. Like on Twitter, sometimes people use videos like of something that's happening, right? And you don't know necessarily if that's actually happening right now. It happened 2 years ago. It happened 4 years ago, right? So you don't know the context always, right? And so there's times certainly where I've seen a video and been like, oh my God. And then you're like, oh, actually, this is old, right? And so it's repurposed video to kind of to try to try to suggest a narrative, right? And sometimes it takes a while until you see another news item and you're like, oh, wait a minute, what I saw before was suggesting something else. But certainly sometimes seeing video in action somehow, for me, it maybe not just me, it's like it grabs you, right? Like here's boots on the ground, right? Like that you can see the actual video evidence, and it's not always evidence.
Yeah, and it's true, Eric, that, I think traditionally, and it kind of brings me to something I was going to mention in my next slide, but this idea of fake news is not new. But as Eric points out, there are new outlets for it, including, not just social media, but videos too. Interestingly enough, I was doing a little poking into this issue, and in thinking about sort of fake news as having a very long history in our country. Benjamin Franklin actually created a fake newspaper article back in, the era of the American Revolution, and that said that Native Americans had scalped 700 colonists, right? Children, men, women, in an effort to drum up public hatred, because they had supported, the Native Americans had supported, many of the Native Americans had supported the British in the revolution. So he basically just wrote a completely fake news article that, said that the Native Americans did these atrocious crimes to get for a political agenda, right? To drum up hatred. I remember learning about, although I can't remember the details because it's been a while, but I remember learning the term yellow journalism, right, in grade school or high school. This idea that during the Spanish-American War, that there was, again, kind of propaganda, these kind of fake news articles that were meant to sort of sway people's opinions. So the idea of fake news is not by any means new, but the problem is, or the sort of the complication that we struggle with, or that we must face, is that now we have so much news, right? There's not just the paper newspaper, where there'd be at least, we would think, some kind of editorial process, right? Even journalists, as I'm pointing out, historically are not immune from writing with bias or writing for propaganda. But at least with a newspaper, there's some sort of like editorial process. Now, anybody can publish whatever they want on the internet, and there's a lot of good things about that. But we have social media where information is disseminated. As Eric was pointing out, people are able to share videos, and they're really impactful. We talked a little bit earlier about the impact of images, pictures, but videos even have a more sense of, have an even greater sense of realness, right, or of urgency going on. So, this idea of fake news is not new, but it's something that I think, especially in recent years, has become so much more prevalent in the world around us.
Karen wanted to raise her hand. Karen, do you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you. So you asked about students, dealing with students with this issue, and I have several students. I have 4 students in LVA who come from all different countries, and I've had the same students for quite some time, and we deal with this issue quite a bit. And I would just like to comment a little bit, because the 4 students who come from all different places are very similar in age, and they're all women, but they all have very different viewpoints on some of these issues you've talked about. And I've struggled as a teacher online with ESOL somewhat because of the very different viewpoints my students have. And I'd like to just point out, from listening to the discussion, that we all have different viewpoints, and as you're talking, it sounds like you're saying that there are 2 different viewpoints. Like, you're making the issue very black and white, as if either you believe in real news or fake news. And everyone at this point in this country reads different sources and watches different TV. I would like to point out that I have a master's degree in political science, and I've learned that most of the news channels and the media in our country has been taken over by a very small group of media conglomerates. And any news that we watch has bias. When we discuss certain groups, demographic groups, who may have been, like Eric said, experimented on in the past, we have an idea, we have a personal bias in our mind that today is somehow different than the past, but it's probably not. It's not like all of a sudden now we haven't escaped the negative things that have happened before us. So just because it's present time doesn't mean that the fears that people have, right, are all of a sudden, not justified. A lot of people are vaccine hesitant. The women that I am teaching right now came to this country because it's a free country. They came here for opportunity, and they came here because there are freedoms in America that they didn't have at home. So when I'm teaching them about things like vaccines and suggesting that they should get them because it's the, you know, it's possibly the better choice, I have to remember in my mind that it's also a free country, and it's also, they have freedom of autonomy of their bodies, and they're free to make their own decisions in the United States, right? Like they're free to make these choices, and some of them are watching they're watching the news, which is telling them that vaccines are bad for them. We have US senators that are telling them that vaccines are bad for them. I mean, like just now this week, Senator Rand was arguing with Fauci about how the US is experimenting on vaccines. But I think we have to be careful with the conversation in making it so black and white.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that, Karen. I just want to, I'm assuming that you're close to Doug, but I just want to be super duper clear. I'm not at all talking about convincing your students to get vaccinated or convincing your students to trust a particular news source over the other. You know, what I am definitely doing is thinking about how we can make students more aware about what they read and whether they read it, you know, whether they see it on CNN or Fox News or, you know, any of these websites that I'm showing you that are purposely deceitful. The point, I'm not interested at all in changing students' minds about any of these issues, but what I want them to see is that the information that they're getting about these issues from all different perspectives, from all different political leanings, you know, to be careful about what they're reading and to think critically about it and to be able to see, you know, those red flags that tell us something's not true. To your point of, you know, about the vaccinations, I absolutely agree. I think people should make, you know, to do the research and make the decision that works for them. But my point is to help our students understand the information they're getting is not always there to help them, right? That, and I'm not talking about sort of like biases that we all bring to information. I'm talking about kind of willful and purposeful misinformation. And that's what I'm talking about here. I'm not in any way suggesting that we need to be counseling our students about, you know, important issues. This is about how students get information and helping them navigate that. So I just don't want to be, you know, misinterpreted as promoting a certain agenda myself. It's not the case. I think we're talking about information literacy and how our students get information. So I pointed out these kind of hot topics to show how kind of insidious this can look for us and for our students, and that these are really big decisions. You're absolutely right that people have the freedom to make those decisions, and I support that 1000%. But I want my students to make decisions that are based in reality, right? And that aren't meant to deceive them. So I hope that that maybe clears up a little bit of confusion about and what I was saying and why I use the vaccine examples. It's not a particular stance on vaccines, but just that that is a topic that's out there, you know, in the news currently.
No, Jen, I think you've
So
been.
Jen and Eric, I think, you know, and we don't have much time left. And this is all interesting, but from an instructor's standpoint, what digital literacy strategies and or resources would you recommend we use with our students to help them improve their critical reading skills with informational text?
I do have some ideas, Marilyn. Is that okay, Eric, if I skip to that? Okay, wonderful. So I give you some definitions here of fake news, but as Marilyn points out, I want to give you the practical stuff so you can check this out on your own. As we've already been talking about, words have power and people make decisions about what they read in the news, which we've already been discussing. Okay, a couple of things that I just wanted to mention really quickly before I give you the practical stuff. And we've sort of been, you know, gesturing towards this. The point about the fake news is not just isolated misinformation being delivered, but that people become cynical or mistrustful that there's any facts, right? That there's any knowledge out there. If we can sort of cherry pick articles to match our agenda or match our beliefs without critically thinking about things, then there's no defense against this misinformation, right? If everything is sort of fake, right, or we don't trust anything out there, then we don't actually, when it matters, we think that there's no truth, and that's not actually true. So there are a couple of quotes here, that people start to not believe the truth because they become so cynical of what they read in the news. And I feel like, for myself, I feel that way, to the point earlier, about a bias in the news. Yes, right? It's a real thing. So when we become so mistrustful of any information, then we're putting ourselves at a disadvantage, because again, the decisions we make might not be in our best interest. Okay, so to the practical stuff. And we've already sort of talked a little bit about this too for our students. Our students are making decisions. They might be just, as a non-native speaker, it's difficult enough, but when you add in this kind of deceitful packaging of misinformation, it becomes even more important to sort of help safeguard our students against this. So here's a list, and again, you can click on these later at your leisure. These are some really good fact-checking websites that can be really helpful. I really like Snopes. The BBC Reality Check is a good one. I tend to find that like sources that are outside of our country are a little bit more objective about what's going on, so they can kind of provide some, as I said, objectivity. This is a really cool one. You can do a reverse image search from Google. So as Eric was talking about with the videos, I don't know if you can do it with videos, but you can do a reverse image search where you can see where an image actually originated, so you can kind of fact check where it came from and if it's legitimate as well. So, and I have a handout that I can share in the chat once I unshare my screen, that lists these as well as some other things as well. Another thing you can do that's included on the handout that I'll give you is you can pull up a homepage for students and just sort of have them point out to you like what looks like a real article and what doesn't, or what might be an advertisement versus a news article. Because even just starting there, so not even thinking about kind of like deceitful, like propaganda stories, but even just helping students understand the difference between an article and an advertisement, for instance. So if I just pulled up this website, Slate, I could have students, look at this top banner, like, is this an article or not? Or is this an advertisement or not? And how do you know? And a student might say like, oh, I see that there's this coupon code here and they're trying to sell me something. So this is, an advertisement. Is this an advertisement? Well, it has a headline, and, this looks like an article. Okay. And just kind of having the opportunity to talk through, what does sponsored content mean? Or even just having the conversation, if students aren't aware that, some things that we find on web pages are, information driven, articles, and some are, advertisements or selling you something, and that can look really similar. So even just having that conversation, having students practice with that. Another idea I had is you could take an example news lead. I don't know how many students get information from actual newspapers, but I imagine some read them online. So here is an example news lead that you could use too. And in a lot of ways, this looks legitimate, but you might talk about with students sort of why this might not be real. And if you click on this URL, you'll find that this is not actually CNN. Something that I've learned in learning about fake news is that a lot of websites will use this .co website to make it look legitimate, but this doesn't actually take you to CNN if we just click on it really quickly. It's a kind of fake news website, but you can tell by the language used in just this lead that it's like incendiary, right? That the Syrian government is planning attack on the United States. Like, wow, that's a really attention-grabbing headline that you might see, right? So that would get your attention. We see this talking about taking revenge. You might have students compare this with what the actual news lead is. And you might show, you might click through and look at the actual New York Times article. You might talk about, You might show students how this one has an author and a date and a location. You might, read through the language and see how it's not meant to like provoke, it's not provoking, right? It's not as incendiary as the original. So you could do an example like this where you took a kind of real news story and just walk through sort of like the conventions of it and how that looks versus something that's not real. And finally, the last thing that I have for you, and I'll share it in the handout in just a second, but I have a list of a couple news websites that might be that, well, I'll just kind of show you them. So Newser is one that has short news summaries with with a lot of pictures. So this can be great for English language learners or people, where you could read the news together in a way that was more manageable. And again, have those conversations about like what to look for in terms of a legitimate news source. I really like these two, News in Levels and Smithsonian Queen Tribune. I like these because you can read a particular article with multiple levels of complexity. So you can see in the little picture here, there's 1, 2, and 3 levels. So you could read news stories with your students together at whatever level is most appropriate for them. There's another one called Learning English here, which again has a really good, very user-friendly way for students to access news stories. So another idea that you could do with students is to check out, one of these sites, and kind of, again, as I said, not just for like content, like you're not about, changing their minds about something, but just helping them to gain familiarity with what it looks like to read the news. And the last thing I have for you is just this, it's kind of like a fact sheet. It's a list of things that you can, that might be helpful to go over with your students that can help them decipher and see when they're trying to be deceived. So, if something's written in all caps, or if there's a lot of pop-up ads, as you guys noted, look at the domain name, right? Something that we talked about, all kinds of things. So I'll put a link to this handout in the chat in just a second. But those are a couple practical ideas, using those websites with students, having them evaluate news leads, and even just kind of walking through a website and distinguishing what's an advertisement from what's not. And I'm looking at my time and I see that we are at like 11, so we're probably just about out of time.